Hey guys, hope you've had a very good week. Sorry this is a little bit later than I usually publish my tier lists. It's just because the API has been down and having a baby makes it a little bit more difficult to do things at the speed I used to. But especially with VG Pro not having the API being fed to it anymore, it's a pretty huge deal in terms of assessing what is good across all the regions. So I've had to do a little bit of searching on Twitter. I've talked to a lot of pro players, kind of asked the high-level players what they thought. So this is the tier list that I'm going to run with for update 4.1. And this is kind of assessing a lot of people's answers as well as my own thoughts based on the buffs and nerfs that we've seen over the course of the last update. So what you're going to see is my thought process based on each role, and I'm going to talk about the individual picks in detail if I can. The reason I haven't got a full S tier bot lane carry is I don't think there are any bot lane carries, and I've talked to a guy called Binny who helps me out with these tier lists a lot, and he kind of gave me this thought process. But I agree, I don't think there are any bot lane carries that I would go through the draft phase and say I need to pick or ban this 100% of the time. I think Kinetic might be closest. Kinetic was already good on the last update. She got a buff on update 4.1. However, I think actually weapon power carries are quite balanced right now. I think you can have a multitude of weapon power carries depending on what your composition wants to fit. I think Kinetic, Ringo, Gwen, Adagio, and Baron are all very good. I think Idris is decent, especially with the buffs. I don't think he's great. I think Vox is okay as well. And I think Kensei is okay. The reason I put Kensei where he is because despite the buffs, he is still mostly a tank shredder. So he's still really good versus tanks, and he's got better versus the backline carries, but he's nowhere near the broken status that he was previously. Silvernail did get a buff on update 4.1, but it was only a buff to his stakes, and I don't really think that's changed the way that Silvernail plays too much. I think the nerfs to his B over the last few updates have really hurt him. Kestrel received quite a few buffs, which is why I've put her up to B. She's not a great team fighting weapon power carry. She still really struggles to deal with tanks. So especially when you're relying on your Glimmer Shot for damage, tanks can just body block those, and she's not the best base attack weapon power carry in the world. So Kestrel again is like really hit or miss. I think she's a great split pushing weapon power carry, but I just don't think she's a great team fighting weapon power carry. And Skye got some buffs on the last update. Again though, Skye is one of those weapon power carries that I think is mainly a counter pick in certain scenarios and fits compositions in certain instances. Now you might ask me, Excoundrel, why is Petal so high up? Well, Petal got a buff on update 4.1 that allows her to get a 1.2 range at level 1. And this makes her very cheesy in the laning phase if you play her weapon power, because she can just like bully your opponent out of lane at obscene levels of range, which is just something that I think makes her kind of fun. I don't think she's going to be as viable as the rest of the weapon power carries because she drops off fairly hard, but I think that for that instance of just being able to bully someone out of lane, that is kind of what Petal does well, just with the buffs that she's had. So I like the thought process with Petal there. All right, having a look now at the mid laners, and I think most people would agree with where most of the mid laners are right now. With the Magnus nerfs, he used to be absolute S tier. Now I think there is a triad of really top tier picks, and those are Celeste, Scarf, and Magnus, all of which you'll see in I'd say you'd see those in 95% of your games. You know, these are the three mid laners that are gonna be present in lots and lots of games. Below them, Samuel got a nerf, but he's still good. Like, don't get me wrong, Samuel is still a good mid laner. His sustain got hit, but his ability to poke someone out of lane, he's still very oppressive in the early levels, and he's still actually quite good against Scarf and Celeste. So don't count Samuel out despite the nerf. He did get gutted pretty hard, but he's still quite good. Malene also A tier. I think she's also a good jungler and a top laner, so Malene is just very versatile. CP Vox got some big buffs, and that kind of brings him right back into the meta, so you'll probably see a lot of CP Vox as well. CP Ringo got some big changes too, and I actually genuinely think CP Ringo is fairly viable. Hellfire Brew does a lot of damage and deals its damage over a shorter period of time, making it more impactful in team fights. And I also think Varia, I kind of put Varia way down before, but I think Varia is still viable. Like, despite her nerfs, Varia is still a good CP carry. Below that, I would say that you've got the likes of Lorelei, Lyra, and Anchor. The reason Anchor is so low is because she's probably better suited to the jungle and top lane. and she gets bullied pretty hard in the mid lane, so that's why Anchor is so low. I was considering putting CP Kinetic a bit higher with the buffs, but I still think you'd just rather pick any other mid laner than CP Kinetic, so that's why I've kept her down. Idris is down in C. Now, Idris is a really difficult carry to make work in the mid lane because it's so easy to bully him, and now that Iron Guard contract is out, he requires a lot of babysitting. You need to have him paired with a Lyra or Adagio in the captain role, otherwise he's just going to get poked out of that lane. However, remember, if CP Idris can get to late game, he is still really strong. It's just about getting him to that point, and from the mid lane, it's really hard to do. So yeah, that's why sort of Idris is fairly low. And then you've got the likes of Baron, not very viable, and Gwen, not very viable either. CP Baron got hit pretty hard recently, that's why he's kind of not particularly viable at all. Alright, let's move on to the top lane role, and I think top lane hasn't shifted too much. Lance, I still think is a great top laner. Sang Feng had no nerfs on update 4.1 that makes him one of the best top laners in the game, and Reza also no nerfs on 4.1, which makes him really strong. Shortly following those guys, Grumpjaw and Lorelei. The reason Grumpjaw got put down from S tier is he did get some nerfs, but he's still, I think, a very good top laner. Then you've got Adagio, Grace, and Meline, who I think are great. Jewel got some pretty significant nerfs, which is why I've moved her down to A/B tier, with Glaive, who I think is also a really good top laner. Then you've got the likes of Anchor and Inara. Anchor, I think, more suited to the top lane because it's 1v1. She isn't likely to get bullied in a 2v1 scenario from the mid lane. But again, Anchor in a position where there are probably just better top laners that you want in this scenario. Then we're kind of rolling down the list a little bit. I moved Rona up from where she was previously because of the buffs, but I still don't think Rona is that good, unfortunately, all of you Rona fans. So I think if you're going to be looking to play a top laner, you're likely going to be picking Lance, Sang Feng, Adagio, Grace, Reza, Meline, Lorelei, and Grumpjaw, and then maybe Jewel and Glaive. If you're an Inara player, you probably pick Inara, and if you really want to play Anchor there. But then the rest of those guys are very unlikely to see too much play in that role. People might see a bit of Blackfeather. Blackfeather's still, for some reason, in a bit of an awkward place in 5v5. I think CP Blackfeather works quite well from the jungle. I think Weapon Power Blackfeather, because you're in a 5-person situation, you kind of get burst down really quickly. In 3v3, Blackfeather was really good because there was very little way to stop him once he had Serpent's Mask from sustaining off the back line. But in 5v5, there's so many extra sources of damage and layers of CC that he has to get through. He's a little bit like Rona. Rona and Blackfeather were like kings on 3v3 before 5v5 came out. But they aren't really suited to the 5v5 style of teamfighting. And there are better split pushes than them. And overall, they don't really fit in the meta that well. So yeah, those are the top laners that I think currently sit in the standings. And remember, if you want to just get the best out of your role, you're probably going for the S or A tier picks. If you feel like you want to try one of the other ones, they are specific scenarios, and try them at your own risk. If you're a good player with them, you can probably still get those wins. Alright, now the jungle is the one that I kind of separate out into a very different style of tier list, because the jungle has several different roles in terms of what you want to bring. Now, usually I'd compare them in their respective roles individually, so if you looked at my last tier list, you might have seen the likes of Scarf and Celeste up in B tier, but then I realised that wasn't really a fair way of assessing the jungle. You kind of need to compare all of the roles together, and there aren't really any good mages in the jungle right now. Ryan and Jewel are okay, but they got nerfed and aren't optimal. Meline is the only mage, I think, that works really well in the jungle. So if you're picking a mage, unless it's Meline, you're going to hamstring your potential from the jungle, and I think Meline is really up there in terms of how good she is. Then you have assassins. Reza and Anchor in the jungle are very good. And then you have Kosh Kataka, Ilva, who are all great too. Aren't that many assassins outside of this who I would rate really highly. And then tanks. I think Inara and Lance are still really good in the jungle. And I think Grumpjaw is, again, moved down from S tier because of the nerfs, but he's still a great jungler in every respect. I've put on A tier Glaive, Sang Feng, and Fortress. Now, Sang Feng's better suited to top lane, but I still think he's a good jungler. Fortress has been kind of rising in popularity, and I still think Glaive is one of the better junglers out there, mainly because I'm a bit of a Glaive fanboy. I really like Glaive. I just think his ganking is so good. Below that, you've got the likes of Tony, which I'm sure Maxman would have wanted me to put at triple S tier. You've got Grace, Yates, Flicker, who are all okay junglers, but they're just better suited to other roles. Grace, unfortunately, is in an awkward position where she's not quite good enough top lane, not quite good enough jungle, and not quite good enough captain, but she's still just a decent pick in most respects. I put Baptiste and Alpha a little bit further up than I did usually. They are good picks. I want to be clear about that. They're both good picks, but there are just better picks right now. And someone mentioned to me Churnwalker jungle, and I have seen a lot of Churnwalker jungle. It just requires good team play to make work, and that's why I'm not going to recommend it at a very high point in the tier list for solo queue, because I just think there are better junglers for solo queue. Unless you can snowball with Churnwalker. Churnwalker feels really good when you're ahead. He's really good when you've got a coordinated team. But he's not so good when you're playing in solo queue and your team doesn't really know how to play with it. So I'm going to put him on the list, but I don't think he's super strong without a team that knows how to play with a jungle Churnwalker. And finally, captains. You're going to notice there's very little change to the captains right here. I still think Lorelei, Lyra, and Adagio all really high tier for me, with Churnwalker and Yates also at that position too. And then below that, you're just starting to see the sort of standard picks like Lance, Arden, Finn, all great picks. Grace, Catherine, and Fortress, all decent picks. And then you've got the more off-meta picks. I mean, Flicker, since the nerfs, hasn't been great. Tony is an okay captain. Grumpjaw and Baptiste are viable. The reason I rate Adagio and Lyra so highly is, and I know some people don't really rate Adagio at the same level that they rate Lyra, especially because Weapon Power Adagio is good and Top Lane Adagio is good, but I think Adagio in general is just a good pick right now. But the reason I rate them so highly is because Iron Guard contract is gone, and there is a very, very limited amount of sustain that you can have in the mid lane. So having someone sustain in the mid lane is really important, because obviously if you're babysitting someone who isn't so good, you want as a captain to be able to make sure that you're giving them the best platform for success. So Lyra and Adagio babysit your carries because they suck. And also if you're a good carry, you can go for more aggressive trades, knowing that you're going to have the captain that's going to be able to provide sustain for you without having to back. And most mid laners aren't going to go something like Book of Eulogies early on, so they're not going to have that sustain built in. Samuel's the only mid laner that's going to get that free sustain, which has been nerfed in the last update, which that makes these sustain type captains really good in solo queue, because most people need that level of sustain to make sure that they aren't losing their lane really hard. So if you can get that and babysit your carry with a high sustain captain who is pretty good elsewhere otherwise, you're in a great position. I think Lyra is arguably better than Adagio, but I do think that I like Adagio as well, in terms of being there to support his mid laners and being able to give them that sort of sustain. Most people wouldn't agree with me, because he's probably better suited to top lane or to bot. But I think Adagio is just a good pick across the map, and I think he's one of those picks that is so versatile. You can pick him very early on in the draft and just rotate him to wherever you need him, because he just functions really well in almost every role. All right, guys, that is the completed tier list of Update 4.1. Hope you liked it. And I will see you very, very soon. I will try, and I've been so busy just doing my Apex Legends content, which I'm obviously, if you're into Apex Legends, feel free to check out the channel. I'll link it in the description. And also, I would appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel, actually. That'd be really nice. But yeah, I just haven't had time to do too much on this channel, as well as just being so busy with the baby. All right, guys. I'll see you soon.